All right, so let's get into it. So basically, a lot of people are going to tell you that they know the causes of the Civil War, and they're looking at, of course, economic, the state rights versus federal rights. Slavery is only one of them, and of course, the election of 1860. But basically, we're going to look at the fact that slavery is pretty that much the underlying reason and the number one reason for the cause of the Civil War. So sit back. Let's get into it. So first of all, you have the states' rights versus the federal rights. And this is this idea of who controls certain legislation and who has the power to do certain things. And basically, there are those that look at the 10th Amendment and say, because the 10th Amendment says that anything that is not specifically granted to the federal government in the Constitution is reserved for the states. So down in South Carolina, where they're not having a really good time, we started a nullification crisis in 1828, and this set us off. So the nullification crisis specifically is because they passed these tariffs, and South Carolina doesn't like it. They say it's going to hurt their industry, and they basically say it's targeting them. And it started to come into this idea of, really, is the federal government able to enforce this law? So they have this theory that basically, if they have enough people or states or a convention that decides to vote, say, hey, we don't like this, you can nullify a law that the federal government passes. Well, it begins a face-off, and they're like, okay, well, let's see if this works. In the end, it really didn't work. Did it highlight the sectionalism and the idea that they really were differing in the opinions of everything? Yes. Did it really actually reduce federal power? No. So then we move into the idea of expanding into the Western territories as we start to accumulate and acquire new land, and more specifically, the art of slavery expand into these territories. So we have so many things: manifest destiny, blah, 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 Homestead Act, blah, 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 people moving west. That's basically what's happening. So first you have, when we decide to add some of the first states from territories into the Union, you have the Missouri Compromise. And the idea of the Missouri Compromise is basically that they needed to keep everything even. All comes down to the Senate, because you know that if you add a state into the Union, you have to add 2 senators. So to keep the equal representation in the Senate and to keep the power equal, quote unquote, they needed to make sure that every time they added a free state, that they added a slave state. So in the Missouri Compromise of 1820, they added Missouri as a slave state, but they also add Maine as a free state. Then they decide that on the 3630 line, that they are going to say that anything above that line is going to be, slavery is not going to be allowed to expand into that line, and everything below that line is going to be allowed basically to have to expand, and so forth and so on. Well, it didn't last very long, because then you have the Compromise of 1850, as we needed to add more land and more states into the Union, like California, because the California population just booms, and they're going to be coming in as a free state. And the Southerners are like, no, 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 we need a slave state for this purpose. So they also then make a compromise that enforces the law of the Fugitive Slave Law that was passed in 1793, but Fugitive Slave Law basically stated that if an enslaved person were to escape into a northern state or any of the states or territories in which slavery is outlawed, that they could be captured, recaptured. Heck, you could be free and you could be captured, and then basically taken down to the southern plantations and returned, quote unquote, to your owner. Basically, there was nowhere to. So it really has some very specific implications in regards to heightening the fervor regarding slavery, and I'll come back to that in a little bit. And really what it did is just nullified the Compromise of 1820 and continued the debate of slavery with band-aids, and really didn't help anything. Well, the free state California being led into the Union, so they need now some territories that are being brought into the Union as territories in which slavery could expand. So then you have Kansas, Nebraska. And Kansas, Nebraska is one territory, and they want to basically make it 2 separate states. And they decide to instill popular sovereignty. And popular sovereignty is the idea that the people and residents within that state are going to be able to vote, and then they decide whether or not slavery is going to be in that state. Well, okay, that works. So this just, again, keeps it in the debate. It keeps it there by these wealthy elite slave owners and these that are entrenched in government and in the power to continue to keep the practice of slavery not only continuing in the states that it already exists, but now expanding further west. And what it does is, when they do open Kansas up and other, incidents for the vote in regards to being brought into the Union as a slave state or a free state, abolitionists and slave supporters alike head to Kansas. They just flood the state, crossing the borders, because that's just semantics on whether or not you're actually a resident. And some very violent clashes start to arise in these instances, in these times where they're trying to vote, and these protests and things going on. And you have John Brown rising when he's trying to get a revolt, and you have Harper's Ferry, and you have all these things. These violent interactions result in 157 various different deaths. You also have caning of Charles Sumner. Charles Sumner was a senator from the North. He gave an impassioned, emboldened speech about the ills of slavery and how the Southern slave senators just wanted to keep it going and the evils, and they needed to abolish it. And it was a very impassioned speech in the Senate. Well, in comes Congressman Preston Brooks, and he basically comes in with his cane. He just walks right in there, and he just starts beating Charles Sumner over the head with his cane. This just continues to further divide not only the politics, but the people. There's just no winning in this. It just continues to put a Band-Aid over it. It's like taking a wound. Here's a violent picture for you. It's like taking a wound. It is bleeding profusely. And you take a small little Band-Aid and you just throw it over that wound. And you just hope for the best. But eventually that Band-Aid is completely soaked through and you have to just keep replacing it and replacing it and replacing it. And why are they continuing to do this? And why is this divide continuing to grow? Well, we look at the economics and this idea of the very different existence in the North and in the South. In the South, you have specifically an increased dependence on enslaved labor, as the enslaved labor population, hundreds of thousands in the South, and actually a dwindling population of white voters. And so there's a heavy dependence not only economically, because that is how they are making their money through plantations and cash crops and so forth, but also politically. And then you have in the North an increased population because immigrants, immigration coming into the country and a flood of immigrant workers, they're going to go to the North where the jobs are. They're not going to go to the South. They're not going to find anything there unless they are independently wealthy already to start a plantation. They're going to go to the North where they have access to jobs, access to homes in the new growing cities and urbanization and factories and manufacturing. So the population in the North is growing very rapidly, which that does help for the House of Representatives to grow in favor of Northern abolitionism and to outnumber the Southern representatives in the House of Representatives. This is why the Senate is such a big deal. And these growing differences between these two regions start to bring in the idea more of a loyalty to your region, the states that are all thinking in the same ideal way that you are. And this idea becomes known as sectionalism, where it's no longer about the nation as a whole, but is specifically about your region. And that's where that growing divide comes. Well, as this continues to escalate and escalate and escalate, you have the election of 1860. And this is the election of which we had the first Republican president ever elected, which was Abraham Lincoln. That guy. So there was these famous debates, the Lincoln-Douglas debates, and there were a lot of very passionate speeches, and Lincoln has quite a few speeches that are very notable during this time, where he basically sanctifies the idea of keeping the Union together, the force of the Union, the federal government, and the responsibility that the federal government has for the entire nation, spoken against slavery and pro-abolition. He was against expanding slavery into the Western territories, and so, of course, Northerners loved him, but the Southerners supported Stephen Douglas. And so in the election of 1860, you have a huge win for Lincoln. You do have a couple third-party voters in which they do steal some of the electoral votes, but Lincoln was able to garnish pretty much every northern state, and Stephen Douglas was able to garnish pretty much every southern state. That's kind of how that sectionalism goes. And, well, when you look at the amount of electoral votes because of the height of the population, Lincoln won with 180 electoral votes in that election because Stephen Douglas was only able to garner 12. Well, this became the last straw for Southerners and for Southern states. They knew with Lincoln as president that they weren't going to get anywhere and that basically he was just going to champion federal rights. And so they just decided their basic thing was to secede. So I'll come back to that in just a second. So let's get to slavery. So how does slavery really act as the catalyst for every part of these particular things? Let's look at some major things that are highlighting slavery and the expansion of slavery and how slavery plays a role in the growing conflict of these times. Of course, we mentioned the Fugitive Slave Act that was be reinforced with the Compromise of 1850, and that further brought attention to the fact of there was no escape for those enslaved persons, even if they came to the North, in which many people were working with the Underground Railroad, and you have these movements to try to bring enslaved persons to the North to free them. But now you couldn't. You have the Dred Scott decision in 1850, which starts to establish that Black Americans are not citizens, and more specifically, enslaved persons are considered property. And so they are very much reducing these human beings to, objects. You have Frederick Douglass is just one of the notable activists bringing attention to slavery and the conditions of slavery and the experience of slavery. So Frederick Douglass was an enslaved person. He escaped and he became very much a public speaker, a writer, and an abolitionist, an activist. And he gave several extremely amazing speeches, but he also wrote these really detailed books in regards to his experience as an enslaved person and what it was really like, very much speaking as a voice for those who are still enslaved. One of his main books, The Narrative of Life of Frederick Douglass, American Slave, was published in 1845, and then My Bondage, My Freedom in 1855. In these two books, and he also is very well known for his specific excerpt, What is the 4th of July to a Slave? And the idea, of course, questioning and challenging the freedom of America, being that how can America be so free when there is an entire population of enslaved people the country is being built on? So not only that, but you do have the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852, again highlighting specifically the conditions of slavery in which you can no longer say, oh, well, they're being taken care of. No. Slavery was a horrific and degrading practice that was allowed to exist. So you have these books that were highlighting and bringing the condition of slavery to the forefront, and to Northern abolitionists growing the movement even further, and really increasing the fervor in slavery. So when you look at everything that is happening, you have Abraham Lincoln that is champion Union strength and abolition, which makes the Southern states and landowners angry. You have the expansion of slavery and how that grows in conflict and sectionalism into the West, and how that brings in even popular sovereignty, which is all about voting on whether or not it should be a slave state or a free state. And then, of course, you have bleeding canvas, violence that is all circling around the aspect of slavery. You have specifically then the South and the increased dependence on slavery and how it's the basis of their economic status and structure. And, of course, the growing awareness of the conditions of slavery and the growing outcry against slavery in the northern states against the southern states. So all of these things, specifically all pointing to the aspect of slavery leading to what is dividing the two regions, the North and the South, leading to Southern secession in 1860, with South Carolina being the first state to officially secede. And of course, it was the answer to the question why. It's slavery. And that is what heightens this divide between our country, that one singular concept that just intertwined into everything that was happening leading up to 1860. So this is what leads us to our Civil War and the two sides fighting each other in 1860 to 1865. That is it. Thanks for watching.